welcome to The Sound of Economics. I'm Vanessa Cottrell.
And I'm Giuseppe Porcaro.
We're bringing you this podcast from Bruegel, the Brussels-based think tank specialized in economics and economic policy. Today we're going to concentrate on trade relations between the European Union and China. What potential for growth lies in these ties, and what might be the impact of initiatives such as the Chinese One Belt, One Road?
First, we are going to hear from Alicia Garcia Herrero. Alicia is a senior fellow at Bruegel, and she's based in Shanghai. She works on a range of topics related to Asia, and she especially focuses on China. We asked Alicia to give us a brief on where the EU and China currently stand and why their trade relationship is so important.
If we look at how the world is evolving, the US pivoting to the east, to the Pacific, and China taking space from mainly Europe, but if you want NATO transatlantic alliance, it's basically eating up space from Europe, through the west of China, east of Europe. So the key question is, what should Europe do? And of course, the logical thinking would be, if TPP really goes through, which is a big question given what we're hearing during the American the American campaign for the elections, where both candidates basically are very hesitant on TPP. But say it goes through, Europe's is kind of increasingly inclined or increasingly obliged, if you want, to look eastwards, and that the final, goal is basically China.
When it comes to trade, the US seemed recently more interested in the Pacific than its Atlantic alliance. Does this situation leave any room for the EU and China to get closer? We asked Pascal Lamy, former General Director of the World Trade Organization, where the potential in this relationship lies.
There is room for China and EU to get closer. EU is further from the Pacific than the US, but the EU-China relationship is less abrasive, less aggressive than the US-China relationship. If you look at public opinion, Europeans are much less anti-Chinese than Americans. So I think there is a window there which could be better exploited.
We also spoke to Lawrence Lau, who is professor of economics at the University of Hong Kong, and believes that the EU and China could both gain from closer relations.
I think there's room for a EU-China free trade area. I think it would take a long time to negotiate it, but I think to start the process would be very positive, because if you think about it, the EU and China together, they account for more than two-thirds of world trade. I mean, that's a huge amount, right? I mean, and the US is only around 10% or so. So the two economies together is huge. And GDP-wise, combine the two, you're also talking about more than one third of world GDP. So if one can work it out, it would be very positive.
But what are the challenges for the EU to get closer to China in the form of a free trade agreement? We asked Alicia.
The challenges nowadays are huge because we're in a different phase of the kind of the relation or the image, if you want, of China in Europe. I think we went through the honeymoon. We had this first position paper by the European Commission in 2006, where we had this very positive view of China-EU economic relations. We had a second one in June 2016, so only recently, which is increasingly, it's a huge change in the approach towards a more, I wouldn't say negative, but certainly more awareness of where the problems lie with EU-China relations in terms of excess capacity, impact of China's excess capacity for European exports, if not even, for European production, for some key goods for Europe, such as steel, etc. So we do seem a more belligerent, if you want, approach towards China. So this means that it's going to be increasingly difficult to get any negotiation going for a free trade agreement with China today. It would have been so much easier in 2016. But there we didn't have the pressure because TPP was not even it was not even in the making. So in a way it comes late in the game at a very difficult time for Europe, a more protectionist Europe, let's face it.
So if Alicia told us that it is quite critical to have a free trade agreement with China and the EU, but that we are in an historical moment where it's actually very difficult for such an agreement to take place, we asked Jianwei Xu, visiting scholar from the Beijing Normal University, to Bruegel, what would be the scenario if actually the United Kingdom, in light of Brexit, would be arriving first than the EU in signing a free trade agreement with China? Jianwei, what do you think about it?
First of all, I personally believe that it's not so realistic for China to strike a free trade agreement with the UK before UK's reach an agreement with the EU, because China, as well as all the other countries outside of the EU, they need to merge together as to sign what we call MFN. It's WTO's schedule of concession with the EU. Before the UK vote to leave for the EU, most of the countries, the UK, the UK follows the concession schedule from the EU, but now since Brexit, it's not so easy for the UK to continue to maintain that schedule of concession. So most important thing for the UK to do is to fix its new schedule of concession. The perfect one is to maintain its own one as this it's within the part of the EU, but it's very difficult. So this is the first realistic difficulty that the UK meets before it's signing any contract with the countries outside of the EU, including China. Second, even if there's I think from China's side, it has very, very little incentive, from economic incentive, sign a trade agreement with the UK, as the UK only constitutes a very, very small part of China's external trade. The only reason that pushes China to join this incentive to sign a trade agreement with the UK is because of the issues outside of economics, just like to gain more influence in the European countries, and then it can extend that kind of influence to the EU countries. But basically, in terms of the economic issues, it's not so urgent for China. And more importantly, UK, as it is part of the European economy, is very different from the other European economies. If you look at the data between China and the UK and the EU, you will find that China basically imports a very large proportion of intermediate goods and capital goods from the UK, and China's exports to the UK is more at the consumer goods. So for China and the UK, it's more like complementary between the two blocks in terms of trade cooperation. But for China and the EU, you will see that although China also imported quite a lot of intermediate and capital goods from the EU, the share of that part is much smaller than the relationship between China and the UK. So that means China has more competitive stance in European market, with also in Chinese market with the EU countries. So it seems that the UK and the EU are not very similar in their trade relationship with China. So for me, yeah, of course, China wants to extend its economic cooperation in the EU, although the UK is only a small proportion in the EU's trade with China. It's still very important as a signal that China enters the EU market, but it's not really a big deal for China. and the China-EU relationship and the China-UK relationship are very different.
Moving from the hypothesis of trade agreements to a project on the making, the Belt and Road Initiative is a transport infrastructure investment from China involving 63 countries between China and Europe. Europe will be in a way a taker of that infrastructure linking China with Europe through an improved railway, the so-called road, and through an improved efficiency of ports, the so-called belt. This promises to reduce massively the costs of transportation. Especially when it comes to the railway link, there will be very large gains in trade. We asked Professor Lau, what does the One Belt, One Road initiative entail?
Ultimately, that's going to create a Eurasian market, right? And infrastructure will be built and so forth, and it would be sort of wasted if you don't also liberalize trade.
We asked Alicia what Europe could take away from this.
Europe is actually a winner, at least trade-wise, i.e. that Europe will benefit in terms of additional growth of exports from China's investment infrastructure, especially transport infrastructure investment on the Belt and Road.
If we want to look at EU-China relations from the EU perspective, which is the initiative that the EU is taking towards China, that maybe it's a win-win situation for China as well?
The EU should clearly engage more in the Belt and Road, not just say I'm a final taker of this improved infrastructure, and follow the process and improve bilateral relations with all of those countries in the Belt and Road, because if not, it's very hard for Europe to see those trade gains. Let me give you an example. Russia is the second largest recipient of loans from China for the Belt and Road purpose, because all of the railways go through Russia. So what are our relations with that country? Because if we're not improving our relations, we won't have trade gains out of this. We could talk about Pakistan, first recipient of Chinese lending. So that's I think, beyond our relations with China. I'm even going beyond that. We need to improve our relations for the countries in the Belt and Road for us to profit from that. And of course, be very attentive and responsive to any discussion of a free trade area among those countries. So it's up to us to start, maybe even before the Chinese do. And that's, I think, something I would like to see in the European policy discussion, frankly.
That brings us to the end of this episode. Thanks for listening to The Sound of Economics. If you're interested in more Bruegel work on EU-China relations, there's also a range of blogs and papers by Alicia and Jianwei available on our website at www.bruegel.org. Bruegel's research program on China is continuously expanding, and we have recently also introduced content in Chinese on the website. You will also find a video of the panel discussion on EU-China relations, which was one of the topics discussed at our last annual meetings. We hope you'll join us again for The Sound of Economics. See you next time.